I'm ready.
We'll start here. Well, the book is called Humility is the New Smart, Rethinking Human Excellence in the Second Machine Age. Edward D. Hess and Katherine Ludwig, or Ludwig, depending on where you're from. We have Katherine Ludwig on the phone right now. And I called you professor, and you're like, I'm not a professor, so let's start there. This book is great because, but it's so ambitious, and I can't wait to get into it, because really, I was thinking about this, and we're basically writing a TV show based on the idea that as a father, I'm raising two small children. In a lot of ways, I feel like what I have to offer, the toolkit I can provide for my son and my daughter, is essentially outdated machinery. Really. I don't know, first of all, what a man is in the next 20 years. I can't, my son, I don't know how to teach him the traditional manly arts. I don't think it matters anymore. And by the way, as we know, with robotics and nanotechnology, I don't know what's going to happen with Bitcoin. There's so many unknowns, but we do know that things are going to be radically different. In your book, you talk about we can probably look forward to losing about 80 million jobs, or 80 million people will be out of work. Maybe 47% of the job sector will be, completely gone. And so one of the things that I thought was interesting is you said, old smart is the new dumb. I think that's the way to categorize it. And we need to think differently. And the way we need to think is not something that comes naturally to us. So there's my assessment of the book, and I want to get into this, and it's great. Great.
It was well done. It was a well done overview. You actually read the book, which is,
Well, we always do. Yeah, we always do, because there's nothing more annoying, I'm sure, than when you spend all that time writing a great book and then people don't read the book, and that's really,
right.
That's not fair. So bravo. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So talk to us about this. How do I get my kids ready for? Look, I'm a stand-up comic, so hopefully robots aren't going to replace me for a while.
Right.
But you never know, by the way. We really are headed for a jobocalypse, aren't we?
Yes. Yes. And, there's lots of debate out there about how soon, certain jobs are going away. And I don't really think it matters to parse that too much, because we're already seeing, drastic changes. So whether accountants are replaced in the next 10 years or it's 15 years doesn't seem to me to be something to focus on. I think we're already seeing that pretty much anything that can be turned into an algorithm will be turned into an algorithm.
Yeah.
And pretty much every aspect of pretty much everyone's job has got some portion of it that could be automated. But so what does that leave? And it really comes down to what we think and what we talk about in the book is that no matter what field you're in, no matter whether it's, an engineering field or it's an arts field, you're going to have to continually reinvent yourself and continually learn. You can never rest on your experience or your current skill set because it's constantly going to be in flux.
But to do that, and you outline this in the book, to do that, you've got to know how you think, right? You've got to know what the pitfalls are. By the way, when I say your book is ambitious, you're asking me to be, you're asking for humility.
Right.
For real, good luck. And by the way, you're also asking me, but I think it's very important, and I think I want to get into this, but you're asking me to think differently. And as I was reading the book, I was going through, sort of my confirmation biases and how I tend to cherry pick data to support my feelings and all those things. So let's get into that.
Sure. So yeah, it's human nature and human nurture that we want to protect our sense of self. And, we kind of cling to our beliefs. And some people are more open-minded than others, whether naturally or because they've been nurtured that way from their own parents or grandparents or what have you. But all of us struggle with it. But just recognizing that it's a struggle should be a step in the right direction, right? So for most people to change their behavior or their ways of thinking about themselves and the world, you need to have the motivation to change, and you need to have a goal, right? It doesn't just happen. You have to constantly work at it. And just recognizing that you're getting in your own way with that sort of autopilot, status quo type view of what it means to be smart and what it will take to be a successful human being. Just recognizing that is enough, I think, and to start on the journey. And so, what we really did ambitiously in this book is trying to make the case that once you see the evidence, once you see the science, once you hear about the predictions, we hope that will change your mindset enough to realize I've got to change. And then you can work on what does it take to actually make those changes habitual, so that you're not working so hard to be humble, right? It's just you're sort of
well, it's by necessity. I mean, it's right.
Right.
I mean, so it's almost like I was thinking about this too, because so much of what I am attached to is the way the world has always worked, and sort of what has always worked for the world. Mm-hmm. And with computer technology and all these things, even the almighty dollar, with cryptocurrency and stuff. I mean, all of this stuff is in flux, and I mean, it's almost like everything is going to change. And when everything changes, you get, and I'm used to. I grew up as a kid where things changed all the time, so I'm pretty comfortable with change. But we're talking about cataclysmic change in many ways, and
right.
Even the role of men in society. I mean, I'm watching this sexual harassment revolution. I think some of it's a little crazy because I'm a guy and I've never had to deal with it. So I'm listening to Mario Batali be accused of lunging at a woman's breast because he was drunk, and then he straddled a girl in the kitchen. And you know what I do? And I'm going to be completely honest. I went, he's an alpha male. He runs the shit. Obviously, what drives him is lust for women. And the guy made some clumsy passes at women. And now these reporters who are women coming after him, and they're trying to bring down the power structure. I mean, this is my emotional reaction to this, where I'm immediately defending the guy I don't even know. I don't know the guy, but he's really successful, so he's got to be, he's got to be pretty cool. But then I have to take a step back, and I have to go, hold on. There's a lot of good that's coming out of all of this sort of revolution, and it is kind of a quiet revolution, or maybe it's not so quiet, but. And one of the things is that men are, for the first time in their history, at least in this country, having to take responsibility for their sexual energy. Where women have always had to deal with shame and always have to worry about wearing that scarlet letter, men for the first time are having to deal with that. And I like fair play. But it forces me as a man and a white man who's always been sort of where just my status has just been there. I've had to contend with this. It's been very, very interesting. And I think at the end of the day, it's a positive thing. But then it brings into sort of the idea of what a man and a woman is. But all of that is changing too, because with automation, the fact that you have an XY or an XX chromosome or whatever it is, or an XY chromosome isn't really going to make such a difference anymore, including on the battlefield, because we're going to be fighting with drones. And so all of these things that sort of are traditional male energies and traditional female energies are all in flux. Mm-hmm. Right? So to hold on to anything almost seems... I still think we're not going to be able to get over our biology. I think our biology is always going to keep us somewhat enslaved, but anyway.
Right. Well, you bring up a good point, which is, and one of the things we point out in the book is that emotional connection between human beings is going to become that much more important, because that's one thing that we don't see machines replacing, at least sooner rather than later, because, we might want a computer to diagnose our illness, but we probably don't want a computer explaining that diagnosis to us. So, these sort of what we used to call soft skills and what we used to think of as females are better at these emotional skills, that doesn't ring true in that women are just going to constantly be scientifically better at those things. It's just, there is this nature nurture debate still raging. But what we do know is that all humans have capacity for empathy and humility. And it's been important in our evolution, despite this sort of Darwinian, misinterpretation of Darwin's work, so that we think everything's about survival of the fittest. But it is true that what we have seen as maybe female strengths are going to need to be strengths for all human beings. And so,
females tend to be more cooperative from what I've heard, which I don't believe. But
I think it's worth noting here that so a lot of what we talk about on this podcast is naive realism, where people confuse their view of the world, which is really their culture's view of the world, for reality. And so a lot of what's being said here when people say, we can't deny the biology and we're enslaved by the biology, is that people are confusing what is their culture's prejudices and their culture's way of operating for this biological reality. And, part of what Katherine's saying here is that as men, we have been told that it's not okay to be emotional, to be vulnerable, to be empathic, to be collaborative, because those are seen as female skills. And those, it's, I think part of what's becoming clear to me in this conversation, Katherine, is that, those sort of traditional notions of masculinity are actually what's going to rub up against those other traditional notions of masculinity as the breadwinner. If you want to be the breadwinner, you're going to have to embrace those softer skills much more. And you're ultimately going to have to redefine your notion of masculinity.
That's a great way to put it, because in the book you've got the old cultural and new cultural ways. The old cultural ways, I'll read them out because they're interesting. Individual wins, play cards close to the chest, highest ranking person can trump, listening to confirm, telling, knowing, IQ, mistakes are always bad, compete, self-promote. That's how I live. That is so ingrained in me because I was raised that way. It's fascinating to me. It's so annoying. And then now you got the what I would call the communist. What I call the collective female communist socialist values that you guys
said the C word.
That's right. The new cultural ways, which are teams win, transparency, yuck. Best ideas or argument wins. That's good. Listening to learn, oh, God. Asking questions, how dare you? How dare you, Katherine? Being good at not knowing? What? Bullshit. IQ and EQ. What is EQ again?
Emotional quotient.
Oh, gross! I don't have emotions. And then I got 3 more before I got to start doing push-ups.
You're a dinosaur, Bryan. I'm telling you.
You're damn right. You're damn right I am. I got to start lifting weights immediately. Mistakes are learning opportunities. How dare you, Katherine? And then this is the worst. Collaborate? How dare you?
Listen, Bryan.
And then the worst, which my wife would laugh at, self-reflect. I'm not self-reflecting. I'm right. I'm too busy. But I mean, these are incredible. You know for real, as a man, I recoil at every one of those things. And I know you're right, damn it. I know you're right.
This is uncomfortable stuff, isn't it?
It really is. It really is. And I'm not exactly I don't think I'm a caveman, but maybe I am.
But is there some part of you that feels like perhaps this will be liberating for you? That, gosh, you don't have to be this strong, masculine, know-it-all who never cries? Is there some part of that feels liberating?
Katherine, I still spar. I still put a headgear on and a mouthpiece in. I step in a ring and I still box, and where I punch other guys in the face and they punch me in the face, and it makes me feel. And when my nose is tender to touch, it makes me feel good. and I swear to God, I was thinking about how messed up I am. I eat meat, not even because I like it. I just feel like meat is important to eat because it keeps me aggressive. I got lots of problems, and I'm being serious. This book is important for guys like me, and I'm not alone. I'm typical, unfortunately. So yes, Yes.
But I think part of what's worth noting, Catherine, about what this podcast has been over 300 episodes, is bringing Bryan to the point where he could admit these things.
Right.
So you are really, I mean, this is a really important moment that your book has helped usher in for Bryan, where he is, you know, admitting that he is powerless over his addiction to this old culture.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great way of putting it. There is an addiction to this old culture, and I think it's probably, who knows, maybe there's some genetic residue. I mean, men have been forced to fight.
You always want to take it back to it being biology, because then it's uncontrollable, as opposed to you have control over it.
Well,
and you could change it.
I better have control over it. I do think it's biological, but if I don't overcome my biology to an extent, I'm going to be left behind. And I think that's the point of this book, is that, and what that requires is humility.
Yeah, and so let's ask. I mean, you know, would you say that Nelson Mandela was a man?
Yes.
Would you say that Mohandas...
Way more of a man than I was.
Yeah, Mohandas K. Gandhi, was he a man?
Yes, he was.
Martin Luther King?
Yes.
Abraham Lincoln?
All right, I get the point.
So the point is that to say that, you know, I mean, when you think about the greatest leaders, they already have these new cultural ways that Katherine is talking about.
That's a really good point.
And so...
Yes. And there is data that supports that those sort of countercultural leadership qualities actually make for better leaders, despite the fact that we all sort of, or it seems culturally pervasive to view the most aggressive, most confident person as the best leadership material. That the data actually proves out that they're not, that these other qualities are what make you an effective leader. So hopefully if that message gets out enough, then we'll actually make those people leaders more often, as opposed to the aggressive, overly confident know-it-alls.
Well, you have to give room to the aggressive, overly confident know-it-alls sometimes, though, because those are the people that push. So Einstein was not known for his humility. You have to, you know, a lot of the great geniuses and the people that revolutionized the human condition were not collaborative. In fact, they spent a lot of time alone.
Well, I think this is where an African proverb becomes useful. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So sometimes there is a place for going fast and going alone. But ultimately, if you really want to change things, you need to bring along the group. And I think
Einstein was really good at, they say, explaining his theories and making them making even a kindergartner understand what he was talking about.
And I think part of what's distinctive about that period of physics, to Catherine's point, is that it was hugely collaborative. You had Planck, you had Marie Curie, you had Heisenberg, you had Einstein, you had Pauli. There was a huge, huge group of people who were working together and sharing ideas and really ganging up on the problem rather than ganging up on each other. But again, you know, humans...
We call it idea sex.
Yeah, we call it idea sex because that's our audience. But
no, I mean, and let me say that I think, Katherine, you're right. I think your book is right. I think Hunter's right, and I do think it'll be, in some ways, I've never even entertained the idea or the luxury that I could be less aggressive or less attached to the old cultural ways, because that is so ingrained into my brain and my entire being as to what a man is. It's really interesting, you know. And all of us have suffered. Women have fallen into that too. They're drawn to that. Maybe it works, right? It works for a lot of men.
Well, when did it work? And I think that's the really important question, Katherine, is that why did these old cultural ways even evolve?
Well,
yes, that's, well, you know, we kind of touch on this a little bit in the book, which is, you know, this culture is not inevitable, obviously. And, you know, we sort of have this sense that, oh, this is human nature. It's always been this way. You know, when we were on the savannah, we had to, you know, it was all about competition and survival. But if you really go back and look at some of these cultural points in history, you know, we talk about hunter-gatherer societies, how they were much more about working together as a group because they had to. And so, Ed, my co-author, likes to make the point that we're heading into this new hunter-gatherer type of culture because we're going to have to be more collaborative. We've got this more contingent economy where you don't work for one organization for your whole life. You're constantly going to have to be hustling for your next gig, whether it's in the gig economy or it's contingent work or it's being an independent contractor or what have you. You have to rely on close ties within your community and relationship building. And so, this sort of rugged individualism, which is really a very Western ideal, is not, first of all, it's not a global cultural phenomenon. And as we see,
but it works.
But you keep on saying it works, Brian, and the point is that it's not working, and it's going to work increasingly less as the technology.
What I mean is, it has worked.
And the question is, again, so in the period of agriculture, right? Firstly, it is a lot of agriculture was about dominance, right? So who could amass the larger society? Who could have more men?
The human story is about dominance.
No, but that's what Catherine's saying is that that's not the human story. That's the story that you've internalized from your culture, is that that's what it is. But if you look at hunter-gatherers, if you look at David Sloan Wilson's work...
If you look at World War I and World War II,
But that's what you're looking at a particular period of human history and a particular period of human experience,
I'm
right?
also looking at a time in human history that pushed our biology way forward. I'm talking about the Renaissance onward. I'm talking about the scientific revolution. I mean, those societies that ushered that in were
So let's talk about these myths. So the myth of the individual, right? Who is the myth of the individual useful to?
I think, regardless of whether it's useful to anybody.
Oh, no, it's useful. Humans tell stories, and they tell stories that serve their interests, right?
Yeah.
So, the West has told a myth about itself, right?
But it's not a myth. Hold on.
No, it's a myth, because everything is a myth. Everything is a story.
That's true. But what I'm saying is that the idea, Katherine, you can jump in any time here, but the point of the individual for the Western mindset doesn't so much have to do with I'm an island. That's not true. The reason, and it still exists in today's world, whether you're on the right or the left. I mean, the left talks about sort of the sacred, your sacred inner sort of self-governance and your own sort of your humanism and how important it is. So whatever you're feeling is takes precedence over everything else. So we have to be careful we don't trample on anyone's sensibilities. So the idea on the right, it's sort of the idea that, as an individual, I can do what I want and the government doesn't get in my way. I mean, so the idea behind the individual for the Western mindset is that a large governing body like the government or whoever doesn't trample on my ability to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, it'd be very general here, but the maximum personal freedom, which comes with responsibility, of course, that's what I think has worked for the most part. That idea that the individual is sacred is part of what the founding fathers were talking about. It's protection against mob rule and against federal oversight. Though that is a very important value. Now, you may say it doesn't work, but it has worked.
Well,
I think what hasn't worked, let's just parse a couple things. One thing is, you may be right that this ideal of a democracy is something we would want to aspire to, that we don't want mob rule or what have you. But I guess what I'm saying is this sort of rugged individualism has sort of been corrupted in a way that it means competitiveness in every aspect of your life. And to your point that, it's worked. Well, it has worked for some people, and especially people who are successful today because they've grown up within this system. And, whether it starts in childhood, well, I'm going to worry about my grades and I'm going to be competitive in sports, and this is what's going to get me into college, and that's what's going to get me a good job. And now I'm rising in my job because I've, had these cultural notions this whole time, and I've been working within that system. That's why it is hard for people currently who have experienced success to look at the data, to look at the science, to look at the predictions and see this isn't going to work. it's not going to work. And it doesn't always work. I mean, we've got, as a parent, right? You're talking about like, oh, it's worked for men. Well, also for parents who are looking at their kids and saying, well, you're telling me all this, but I know that if my kids don't get straight A's and if they don't become, they don't stand out on the soccer field and, oh, they're not going to get into a good college. And so, this idea of I have to worry about myself and my kid and they have to worry about themselves and being competitive and beating everybody else.
They've got to build a skill set. And that requires a great deal of work.
But the big problem,
so what is the alternative? I mean, so yeah, you're right. I mean, how do I get out of that reality? I mean,
but it's not a reality, and I think the point is that skill set equals routine work, and routine work is exactly what automation and robots do best. So your kids may learn whatever skill set, and they may have played by the rules of this traditional system. And then they may find that overnight, the thing that they spent decades and decades building is automated by a robot. And suddenly there is no market demand. And if they're operating as rugged individuals, then they're fucked, right? And you better hope that there's enough of a community that understands that at any point, any one of us could be automated out of existence. So that rugged individualism is not going to work for your kids. They live in a different world, and they're going to need the sort of intuitions, the cultural intuitions that Katherine is talking about.
Which are? Because yeah, go on.
So when we talk about what kind of skill set will be important for humans, it's just as a general rule, no matter what industry we're talking about, you're going to have to be more creative. You're going to have to think critically, and you're going to have social and emotional intelligence. And when we think about things like critical thinking, that sounds like a good thing. It sounds like smart people should be able to do that. But when you really parse it out and you figure out like, what do you really need to do to be a good critical thinker? It's not the same thing as achievement, right? So we focus our kids on get good grades, but we don't really look at the data that shows that if you're only focused on those extrinsic rewards and scoring well on tests, it's not the same thing as learning, and it's not the same thing as thinking critically. And so if we are constantly putting those pressures on for, these sort of extrinsic measures of success, we're not teaching kids the skills that they will eventually need, which is they're going to have to think critically and they're going to have to continually learn. And if you build a kid's sort of mindset so that all they're worrying about is, do I get an A? Yeah. We know from science and psychological research that actually inhibits learning because, kids who are worried about getting the A don't challenge themselves because they don't want to make mistakes and they don't want people to think that they're not smart. So they don't experiment and they don't challenge their beliefs. They don't put themselves in situations to grow.
So how do we, and I agree with you on that. So how do we then, do we restructure our schools? Because some of the schools are being restructured, right? So that is almost the idea behind the Waldorf school and Montessori, there are no grades and things like that. And to an extent, it works for some kids. Other kids are, like my daughter, are motivated by, some people are just competitive naturally.
Well, I don't know that again, like, you keep on bringing this back to what nature is, right?
Nature plays a part.
Well,
it just does.
But the point is, Brian, is that a lot of it is what are your incentive structures. I was massively competitive in high school, right? I don't think that academically you were that focused on grades.
How dare you?
Right. Now, Brian, having become one of the world's experts, second only to your wife, on your psychology, I know that a large part of that was beliefs that you had internalized about yourself and your own intelligence and your potential, right? Yes. You didn't think that school and academics were for you, and so you focused on comedy, on sports, on all of these things. Yeah. I internalized the opposite side of those myths, where I thought that I was academic and that my whole self-esteem was wrapped up in doing well academically, right? That's the whole thing of this podcast is that we got fucked up in opposite ways. And we've been trying to unfuck ourselves over hundreds of episodes, and we're still not there. But thankfully, we have Katherine here to
to unpack things.
Yeah. I mean, Katherine, you have to understand that you are pretty much the perfect, like, spark for this tinderbox. And so, you know, I'm really happy that this could happen and that you could be here for this therapy session.
She does have a very soothing voice. I feel safe. I feel safe. Talk to me more about collaboration and listening.
See, collaboration, this is the important thing. The first 4 letters of collaboration, Brian, are the same first 4 letters as collectivism. The thing that you fear most.
God.
Here, I'll tell you this.
Yeah.
I'm an introvert. And so the idea of, you know, when I used to hear the word collaboration or, oh, this is going to be a group project, you know, I just seethe inside because to me that's not the way I like to work through my ideas. Yeah. But when we say collaboration, we don't mean like a bunch of people in a room, you know, just loving being together all the time. It's more of an approach to ideas and thinking, right? So you can be collaborative because you're willing to listen to somebody else's work or listen to somebody else's perspective as opposed to constantly being in your own little self-absorbed silo of beliefs and thinking.
Yes.
And so, you know,
I think we're suffering in a great, and I want to get your take on this, but I think that we are not moving in that direction. I think we are all creating our own echo chambers, especially politically. And I don't think any of these ideas are moving. I mean, I was on social media yesterday and I was reading tweets among people who are educated. I followed everybody from David Frum to Christine Summers and boy, oh boy, is it amazing how nasty and how unwilling people are, never mind learning or listening, but rather even just to be civil.
That's the inevitable outcome of rugged individualism. Everybody thinks that they're the individual who sees the world as it is, who is right, and anyone who disagrees with them must be blinded by their ideology or a bad person or whatever it is. So if you want to see the inevitable outcome of everybody operating that way, just look at where America's politics is today.
Yeah.
And it's the most extreme in America's politics because the rugged individualism is the most extreme. That's such a core part of the American cargo cult.
Well, at least one side is so indoctrinated in the idea of rugged
both sides are indoctrinated.
Yeah.
You don't have a fight when only one side is indoctrinated in their ideas.
Yeah,
you have to have polar and opposing views where both sides think they're totally right. And in practice, it's not even like both sides. It's a multipolar thing. There are so many different camps. And then they just constantly clash.
Well, there's an article that's fascinating about the Department of Energy and some of the Trump underlings who were indoctrinated in the idea of being libertarian and the government is very small. And they were walking through the Department of Energy with this really arrogant sort of, not really even asking questions. What does this department do? And what they didn't realize was that the Department of Energy not only makes money on its investments, it's got mostly like very serious nuclear physicists in there who are working on things like, keeping track of where all the sort of nuclear fuel, the spare nuclear fuel is in Russia and Ukraine and Azerbaijan and those kind of places. They're doing incredibly important work. How to create like sensors whenever you walk into a stadium so that you make sure that there's, and it was like, guys, not only is this department doing all this work, they're also turning a profit on all their investments when it comes to clean energy. It's pretty fun.
They're doing all the things that Republicans love. And yet they are so ideologically blind that they're attacking a thing that is doing what they love. And the point is, this is why Katherine is saying we all need a lot more EQ. Like, we need to be emotionally aware and recognize that, like, we have strong feelings about certain things, and if we blindly run with those feelings, we're going to create havoc and disaster.
Well, that's what Christine Summers was talking about, intersectionalist feminism, and there was a big sort of rally, and the problem was all the intersectional feminists were breaking up into one group after another. It got to the point where these are women with allergies, and then these are black women who have allergies, then there are black gay women, then there are
these are all very upsetting things to
Brian. Who are dating white women, and they had to check their privilege, and there became a whole hierarchy, and nobody was talking to each other. It just became. Then they finally decided to start singing songs of support, and it was basically like just nothing got done.
But Katherine, I do want to go back to the biology, because part of the biology in terms of collaboration is, we're big fans of, I don't know if you know Joe Henrich's The Secret of Our Success.
I'm not, a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the core insight is there's always been this big question of, where does human prosperity, why have humans become the dominant species on the planet? And the core insight is that, if you give, there's a graph in the beginning of the book. If you give an IQ test to a chimp, a toddler, a human toddler, and an orangutan, that on causal reasoning, we're dumber than chimps. On spatial reasoning, we're dumber than chimps. On quantities, we're dumber than chimps. And the only area in which we're off the chart smart is social learning. We have the ability to form these hive minds that exchange ideas. And so when you're talking about what works based on the biology, Bryan, it's collaboration. So what I'm saying is Katherine is right and you are wrong. And not only are you wrong, Bryan, your culture is wrong. And your culture has created a cargo cult about what works, and what it works for the group of individuals who essentially behave selfishly and have managed to aggregate the wealth of their society in their hands, while fucking over not only the group, but ultimately themselves, because you would have had more prosperity over this period of time if you'd had a more collaborative group.
Yes, and I think I follow the science that is showing more and more, the neuroscience of the brain, that we construct our reality. Whether it's happening consciously or unconsciously, even our emotions are a construction. They're not, there is no such thing as this thing called anger that exists in the world, and we perceive it, and we're, a victim of experiencing it, and that we're constantly constructing our own reality. And so, one of the messages that we want to get out is that, you have a responsibility, particularly if you want to succeed in this new world we're heading into, to open your mind and construct a new reality.
What does that mean? What does that mean? What does that look
so
like?
That means, don't retreat to your little silo and, and hold to your beliefs as being inevitable about the world, right? I mean, when I talk about humility, or when we talk about humility in the book, we mean the psychological definition of humility. So we don't mean, the religious connotation, although there's, obviously overlap. And we don't mean this idea that, if you're humble, you feel like you're less than other people or you're subservient in some way. We mean humility in that you are open to being corrected, that you have an accurate sense of your strengths and weaknesses.
Or maybe just don't be so attached to what you've grown up with.
Yeah, right.
Right? I mean, that's kind of...
Right. And that you're not so self-absorbed, that you can get out of your bubble, because you don't have your ego wrapped up in staying in your bubble, that you're willing to listen to other people. You're willing to subject your beliefs to contradictory information. I mean, if we could just get people to do that, we might have less of this idea politics and people retreating to their corners and only listening to news that confirms what they already know.
I like the way you guys actually phrase it in the book. It's being responsive to the evidence, right? I think, or to data, being responsive to data. The way that's kind of, and most of us are not, right? Most of us are not. We're just not. I mean, you can present somebody with all the data you want and the truth, and they just stop listening.
Well, and especially what Katherine is talking about with disconfirmatory evidence. So, I think that there have been lots and lots of great examples, especially over the last 2 or 3 years, of people who have claimed that they were fired for truth, or that the science was on their side and that they understood the relevant biology.
James Damore.
Yeah. I mean, there's legion examples of this, where what happens is that people cherry pick the evidence, and it's not necessarily malicious. Like, it's not even necessarily intentional.
Right.
It's just that they have their preconceived notions, and when they encounter something that fits their worldview, they're like, oh, this is great. Like, this is real evidence. And then when they encounter something that doesn't fit their worldview, they start to argue it away.
See, I would say that I would blame Google for that. I think James Damore all he was saying, and I read that memo twice, and let's just use him as an example. What he was saying was, here is some evidence, and this may be one of the reasons. Biology may be one of the reasons, and here's what I've been reading. And Google went, you're making it unsafe for women, you're fired. So it goes both ways on that.
Of course it goes both ways. But I think Katherine, we had a...
And he was being responsive to evidence. I mean, he was presenting the science that exists.
Well, but see, the point is that, like, for example, in terms of being responsive to evidence, right, part of the science is all the work in, say, Joe Henrich's The Secret of Our Success, right? That we operate by social learning, right? And that means that what you want is you want a cognitively diverse group with lots of people with lots of different perspectives, right? And it's as simple as this conversation, Brian. Like, we're both extroverts. We start talking a lot, right? And then we have Katherine on the show. And, Katherine doesn't talk as much as she should, since she's the expert that we brought on the show. And that, as soon as we start thinking that behavior is just the biology, then we don't realize that that's what we're doing. And instead of trying to correct that behavior and say, hey, listen, we have the benefit of Katherine Ludwig, who's written this amazing book on, why don't we actually ask her to say her thing, as opposed to, and Katherine, you should know that this conversation is in many ways a parallel to a conversation we had with Jennifer Jacquet. Do you know her?
I know the name, yes.
Yeah, she's at NYU. She wrote this great book, Shame, New Uses for an Old Tool. And we had Katherine on, and what happened was that, like you, she's very attractive, very smart, all these things that Brian and I get excited about. And our vocabulary goes off the charts. And suddenly we want to share all the things that we know.
We're lacking.
And she's basically like, you guys know what you're doing, right? And she's like, you're lacking. Like, this is a dominance display. This is a fertility display. You're trying to impress me. And there have been studies that when
I'm in a squat and I'm running around in a circle with my chest off down.
I apologize for lecking in front of you, Katherine. It really is a form of flattery, because we think that your book is brilliant and we just want your validation.
Well,
it's really what it comes down to.
It's brilliant, but it also triggers a bunch of stuff.
Yeah,
it triggers a great deal for me, a great deal of sort of uncomfortable emotions, because you're asking me to let go of the things that I have embraced I grew up with, right? So it's interesting for me. It's a really interesting exercise.
That's why you need to embrace humility. Because if you're not, what you're talking about is my ego is so invested in this other way. And what we're saying is you have to adopt this other mindset, this other psychological asset, so that you're open to doing these other things, which are going to be skills that you're going to need to stay relevant as a human, unfortunately. Or fortunately, actually. Yeah. Because hopefully it makes us all better people, too.
I think it definitely will. And I think the point of the James Damore thing is that a lot of what I think women have been saying for a long time. We had a conversation with a bunch of Brian. We have a joke that where Brian Callen doesn't come from, because Brian's mother's family is Sicilian. So what you're gonna obviously a lot of this is sort of old honor culture intuitions. And Brian started saying, like, there's all this technology. It's going to be amazing in the future. Like, there's going to be like computer chips we can put in our brain, and I'll literally know what Kate is thinking. And Kate, who was on this podcast, different Kate Fogarty, said, there's a technology that already allows you to do that, Brian. It's called listening. And that's what the James Damore Google Manifesto misses out. Like, all these women have been telling us for ages what their experience is and the ways in which they're excluded. And it's not just about sexual harassment. It's like this conversation where we just start talking and trying to show off, and we're literally not letting the person talk. It's that simple.
It's competitiveness.
It's competitiveness rather than collaboration. And collaboration is just like making sure, if you look at, say, for example, Katherine, do you know Adam Hansen?
Yes.
He's a huge fan of this book. like just such a huge fan. And he, every like, if you look at how he runs an ideation session, he's constantly tracking who's speaking, who's not speaking, and making sure that all the voices are getting folded in. And it's as simple as that. That's part of, you know, what that collaboration is just making sure that the group has the benefit of all the different perspectives.
So, Katherine, are we not headed in that direction? And are we going to just be forced into it no matter what?
Well, I think the message of our book is to get ahead of it and to not be forced to, you know, be in shock when the world changes under your nose. Is we're trying to get this message out. And the reason why we called the book Humility is the New Smart is because smart speaks to people, right? I want to be smart. I want to be the smartest person in the room. I want other people to think I'm smart. And what we're showing is, well, okay, but this definition of smart is changing. And so if you want to be the smartest person in the room, you're going to need to listen more than talk now. You're going to need to have more of an open mind. You're going to have to focus on learning more than achieving. And you're going to have to focus on collaborating more than being competitive. And just hoping that if the message gets out and if people see the data and read the science, that, you know, that they will say, okay, it's not just about being a nicer person.
But what does that look like in schools, in the workplace, and in government?
Well, I mean, schools are, you know, some schools are getting it. Some schools are lagging behind. I'm not a teacher. I think a lot of teachers and a lot of educators are getting the message about these new skill sets and that it's not just about rote memorization anymore. And it's a huge institution, so it's going to be slow to change. But as a parent, as a grandparent, as an aunt and uncle, you know, you spend much more time around young people. And so just by the example that you set, the way you talk to them, the incentives you set for them, the goals you help them set for themselves, you can change their view of what it means to be smart and what it's going to take to be a successful person. In the workplace, I mean, that's, you know, we have a whole chapter in the book about how do you create an environment in the workplace that's more conducive to people learning and innovating and being creative. And it's, you know, we've got this whole cultural change.
Yeah, go through that for a sec. Just give us the highlights on that, because that's a really interesting.
Sure. So, you know, we talk a lot about the 3 Ps, you know, so psychological safety is one of them. And, you know, there's a bunch of research on this idea of an environment that's psychologically safe for people to speak up. And so it's less hierarchical and it's more about sharing ideas and, you know, and it comes from research into surgical teams. And that, you know, surgical teams where there's a lot of psychological safety, where there aren't repercussions for speaking up when you see something that doesn't look right, that those surgical teams are much more successful. The
same thing works. When I was thinking about that, is the same thing works for comedy. If you're writing sketches and you're in a sort of SNL, Saturday Night Live, or Mad TV scenario, it's so important that you're safe to come up with ideas that might not work, because everybody in the room has their funny, but the one thing that'll shut funny down for me and a lot of people is if other people are going to be critical about it. Like, it'll shut you down. Like, because it's a vulnerable thing to say, what if maybe this is funny.
And right? Bryan, I think I'm a huge
fan of that idea.
And something that I think will help Bryan as he eases into his transition from the old cultural ways into the new cultural ways. Do you know what wasn't like that? The Soviet Union, Bryan. So they talked about being collectivist and collaborative, but in practice it was not a psychologically safe environment. It wasn't a place where you could voice your ideas. No. So the genius of America, Bryan, at its best, right, is that it creates exactly what Katherine is talking about. So Katherine is really saying that she wants us to be more American? Yeah, exactly, Bryan.
I'm going to sing
if that's what speaks to you.
Yes. So that was that psychological safety is the first P. What's the second P?
Positive emotions. So we have this, I guess, cultural bias that there are, emotions have no place either in work or in school, and that, you can somehow divorce your emotional side from your rational side. And, what we're finding from the science is that that's not true, that every mental function is infused with either emotion concepts or some sort of affect, is this pleasant or unpleasant, and we know that when people are in a more positive mood and in a more positive environment, that they're better thinkers, they're more creative, they're more flexible thinkers, and so if you really want your organization to encourage innovation and creativity, you need to create a positive work environment. And so, fear of either being reprimanded for speaking up or making a mistake and not owning up to it. If you have a command and control type of hierarchical organization, those don't create positive emotions. Those create fear and anxiety. And so, just focusing on an environment that is more positive would be, more conducive to these types of human skills like creativity and innovation.
And that really comes down to emotional bandwidth. If you're in a state of fear or scarcity or anything like that, the emotional bandwidth is very, very small. Whereas if you're in a state of, if we're laughing, which is obviously what you help create, if we're feeling happy, if we're positive.
You're more yourself. You're more at play.
And you're going to share your ideas. Yes. Essentially, the Wi-Fi in the room goes way up, right?
Martial arts is a good example of this. So cultures that embraced, like Brazilian cultures that were more informal versus, say, Japanese culture. So the traditional karates in the Asian or Taekwondo, and the Asian side is Korean and Japanese that I know of. When you came up with a better idea to kick or punch or a different pattern, you had to be careful because your teacher could lose face. It could make your teacher look dumb. And so you didn't do that. So a lot of these traditional martial arts stayed where they were because total devotion and obedience to your master was how you became a black belt. And your ability to mimic exactly and never question your master was how you became a great martial artist. And then along come the Brazilians and other cultures and Americans who are like, hold on, man, what? I just know I got to knock you out or put you in a hold where you give up quickly. And the cultures that didn't have sort of strong hierarchies of authority were the ones that excelled. And I think that's why improv became an American art form. That's why jazz probably is the highest American art form. And for that matter, rock and roll. So I think your book, as I think about it, your book is bolstered. The arguments in your book are bolstered by the examples of America at its best. We are a very innovative society, and if you look at where we've been innovative, it's been in circles and environments where the 3 Ps, and we haven't gotten to the third P, are the most visible. What's the third P?
Well, the third P is really processes. So this idea that everything in your organization has to be aligned in this way towards bolstering these psychological principles. And the third psychological principle that we didn't talk about is self-determination. So this is research into what motivates people, and what scientists and researchers have found is that you're more intrinsically motivated the more you feel like you have determination over your tasks and your goals. So autonomy, feeling a sense of competence. I have some autonomy over this. I feel like I have the skills to do it. And the sense that what you're doing has a purpose, that it's towards a greater, like a goal, sort of a collaborative goal. Yeah. That those are things that feed intrinsic motivation. And so it's interesting that you talk about Japanese culture because, in some ways, Eastern cultures have a leg up when it comes to this more humble mindset, because humility is very important in their cultures, and in their organizations. You rightly point out that in a lot of ways they don't encourage as much creativity and innovation because of the way that they are so much more about respecting the hierarchy, but they also have this sense of, we don't just reward the stars, we reward the good team members. And so this idea of people working in a team is something that becomes, I think, is much more, that Eastern cultures are much more receptive to that idea of, it's not about the person who stands out, and the person who talks a lot. It's the people who are good team members. And so if you have an organization,
Katherine, what about, I'm sorry, keep going because I want to hear.
No, go ahead. No,
I was going to say, and I think that you're spot on. But then we come into the issue of reward and reward and for that matter, money, which buys you freedom and all the things that money does. That's something that's going to be hard to divest from. So where does that play a factor? How does reward? Because it's so interesting because when you talk about self-determination, which of course is very important, and there's a little cognitive dissonance there, which is fine between being collaborative and self-determination, which I think we've always had to contend with as human beings and societies, and there's nothing wrong with that. But, when you are the most creative in a group, or when you come up with the idea that really makes the difference, which happens all the time, somebody comes up with the idea that kind of like, the aha moment, or for that matter, is the beginning, the middle, and the end of that movement. They automatically and naturally begin to take on a leadership position. They just do. Like, people start to follow them. They work harder. They're more innovative. They seem to be smarter. And they will develop their own legion of followers. Now what? But
you're assuming that's the best idea, right? And what I'm saying is, unfortunately, in the sort of old culture, it's not necessarily the best idea that rises to the top, because of these other, cultural.
It's the loudest
biases, idea. Right? So it's not always the best idea. It's the person who talks the loudest.
Donald Trump.
So the
Brian Callen. I mean, the point is the best ideas in this room belong to Katherine, right? And we've been talking the loudest. So this is just
No, but I'm asking these questions because...
No, but I'm just saying, Brian, that this conversation works on so many levels, right? It's just like an amazing demonstration of everything that Katherine is talking about. And there's no fault or blame here.
Sure.
We all blindly copy culture from our parents, and then this is the challenge.
But not just that, Hunter. I'm also looking at my own experience.
Yeah, exactly.
So you're saying what I'm trying to do is Katherine's talking. I'm trying to unpack and I'm trying to visualize what this looks like in a boardroom because I've been in enough collaborative spaces, especially creative spaces, like when you're on a TV show and you're sitting around a room, or for that matter, you're on a set like I am with the Goldbergs, and we're all coming up with different ideas, right? And it is a democracy, a true democracy in many ways. But at the end of the day, for example, on a TV show, which is pretty collaborative, I mean, you don't get much more, there has to be one showrunner who's the final say, who's the final shot caller. Right?
Well, I think the first thing is that you've been in all these rooms, but you've always seen these rooms through the lens of your old culture. And so you've seen certain things. And in the same way that now, because of all the stuff that's happening with all these sex scandals that are being revealed in Hollywood, you're starting to see things that were always there, but that you didn't necessarily see before. And I think that the more
I didn't see it through the eyes of women.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And so the opportunity now is to start to see the history of the world through these other eyes. And that as you see that, you may start to see these rooms differently. Right? And, we have the benefit of Katherine, we have the benefit of Adam Hansen to really understand how this innovative and generative process works. But, to briefly connect into the Straight A Conspiracy, the book that I helped co-write, because I also believe in collaboration, that what happens is that take someone like Thomas Edison. He didn't invent the light bulb. It was around for 45 years before he was even born. But what he did is that he took his part of the process, his part of the contribution, and he magnified it. And he made it seem like he was the one who really did this. Why? Because therefore, when he's making the great contribution, all the profits and proceeds and power flow to him. So, and the problem is that actually destroys the creative process. So I don't know if you know, there's a famous, the Undoing Project, right? Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky have this amazing collaboration. And the collaboration works well as long as it's about the team. But then Amos Tversky starts taking more and more and more of the credit, and it destroys the marriage. And the goose that lays the golden egg falls apart. Same thing happened with Jonas Salk. Jonas Salk had this amazing team, and they produced the polio vaccine. And then there was this famous speech where he stood up and took all the credit, or took more credit than people felt he deserved. And that destroyed the team. Yep. And without the team, he couldn't do shit. Because all along, the real thing had been that magic team that was really collaborative. I've written
scripts with other people, and I've seen how that happens.
Exactly. And so the big problem is that's what this the rugged individualism has a real place, right? And to your point, like in Asian cultures, you do get this, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down, or, the loudest duck gets shot. And that's not healthy. Right? And so there is a time to stand up and go against the group and to be the individual. But what the opportunity for us is that we now have all the cultures of the world laid before us, and we have to figure out when is the time to stand up and be an individual, and when is the time to collaborate with the group, right? When is the time to speak, and when is the time to listen? And I don't think we got that balance right in this conversation.
I think we're doing fine. I think that's So Katherine, here's what I was wondering what you think of this. Reading the book and listening to these ideas, it's great. But then I get sense. I'm like, this is awesome. And what you're going to have is, as Americans are trying to implement these ideas, and it's awesome, you're going to have a bunch of Asian countries going, yeah, cool. You are going to go learn coding. You're going to go learn robotics. You're going to learn tissue regeneration. And all of their kids are going to be experts at these fields. And there'll be a new elite. And they will be the ones, sort of driving and benefiting from this technology tsunami. And that's what they'll be studying in universities and everything else. And the rest of us will be essentially, I don't know, support on the dole. That's my cynical view of the future. I mean, it feels that way. Like so many of us are just going to be left out.
Well, I guess I would beg to differ that focus on the technical skills is what's going to lead to success. I think that other cultures might have an advantage for a different reason, which is that I think they get the humility stuff a lot better, and this idea that they constantly have to learn and that they have to work at things, that it's not about it's more about effort than some innate intelligence, and we sort of have that messed up here in our schools and in our culture, and so again, I wouldn't tell my children, go after these STEM fields and you'll be fine. I don't know, data scientists are in high demand right now, but you can't just rest on those technical sides of anything anymore, because the technology changes so much. And, we've got this focus on, let's teach kids to code. And there are great aspects of that if you learn to be a computational thinker, which is more about being a critical thinker. But this idea that the coding itself is somehow going to armor them for, a future job is kind of a ridiculous notion, because we have no idea what computer languages will dominate in 10 years. Yeah. And so I think the bottom line is you need to focus on these other skills.
So and you can be malleable, so you can you can learn, unlearn, and relearn.
Right. And if you're a good learner and you're a good thinker, then you can consistently learn and continually reinvent yourself. If you learn these basic skills that come from, I learn more from listening than from talking. If you get that right, then you're going to be a better learner and you're going to be better off.
And isn't this obsession with we're just all going to be coders? Doesn't that come out of I think two things. One, those old industrial age assumptions that the key to sustainable prosperity is having one set of skills that you will implement for your whole life. And then two, the massive, concentration of power in the hands of Silicon Valley, so that they just blindly project on the world like, we're rich and doing well. You can all be rich and doing well by doing the same thing that we're doing.
Right.
And so it is a massive amount of I think this is the big difference, Bri, is that, like with Katherine and the sort of people that we've been lucky enough to have exposure to, we're getting the access to the people who are literally on the forefront of humanity, right? They've had the opportunity to range across a lot of fields and engage in what Big Mike does best, pattern recognition. They've seen all these different dots and see how they're lining up and they're coalescing. And what they've done is, instead of sort of the superficial work, they've done the deep work of what John Haidt talks about, where they're like really have gone down to their elephants, re-examined their most basic cultural intuitions, and they have retrained their elephants to be able to have the right cultural intuitions for this environment. And the challenge is now, and where you become much more important than either Katherine or I, is to make sure that the whole world gets this. Mm-hmm. And the fastest way to move these ideas, BRYAN, is to turn them into comedy.
Yeah, which I've been trying to do, and thanks to Hunter and getting exposed to, people like you, Katherine, because it's so valuable to me, because I can feel myself bucking against all these ideas, even though there's evidence, and ample evidence, and mostly evidence to suggest that this is the way to move. It comes down to also, Katherine, as you were kind of describing sort of how we can't necessarily attach ourselves to one particular type of skill set, and sort of have this sort of malleable mindset. I kind of thought to myself, I found myself saying, well, maybe I shouldn't define myself along these strong lines either. It really comes down to how you define yourself as a person, and that's very powerful. You know? Don't you think?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. I mean, if your ego is tied up in defining yourself as I'm better than this person, or I'm more special than this other person, then your whole mode of operation is to protect that view. And so you're not opening yourself up to learning or growing in any way.
Think about our movies. I mean, think about the movies that make the most money. It is always about this individual. It's changing a little bit, like with X-Men, there's a collaborative process, but and I think movies like It, if you saw It, those kids got together and collaborated to kill the clown. But for the most part, there is still this idea of the lone, rugged Marine who comes back to avenge his family's death or whatever it might be. And that sort of sits really probably mostly with men.
In America.
And in America.
I mean, that's the thing is that is the American myth, right? The American cargo cult is of the lone individual who can defy the world and go out and, sort of change the world, create great prosperity. That is a peculiarly American myth, and it has value. And a lot of those lone individuals have, broken from the mold, defied convention, innovated in ways that, the crowd would never have done. But
it also actually goes back to the Old Testament. I mean, Moses was the individual who said, "Hey guys, I'm talking to God. You're all wrong, and you better listen to me, or some shit's gonna hit the fan." Literally, like frogs and locusts and blood in the water.
And then when they didn't listen to him, all their firstborn died. So fuck them. I was right. Like, you fucking communists didn't listen to me.
Yeah, right. I mean, your book is heretical here, Katherine. Isn't it? I mean, really. I mean, it's an important book for that reason, because I think that this is what's fascinating about this kind of science, because you guys have looked at all the available science on how the brain works, and then looked at all different cultures, and kind of applied all that data, and concluded that we had better let go of some of the things that people like Bryan Callen are so attached to. like the individual and all that side.
I think you're right that stories are the most powerful way of conveying messages. And so if we've been telling ourselves these stories, and, one of the messages of our book is that we need to tell ourselves a new story. We need to tell ourselves, we need to tell our kids, that this new story of what it means to be a important, useful, relevant human in the world.
Yeah.
And to pick up on something that Katherine said earlier, you were making, if we want to talk about the biology and who we are as humans, a lot of what they're saying is very hunter-gatherer. And we have had Chris Ryan, who wrote this book, Sex at Dawn, and has a podcast called Tangentially Speaking. And a lot of what Chris talks about in terms of where we're headed is what he calls paleo-modern. So we get to keep all the technology, we get to have all the lessons of, how you build large-scale societies and organize that, but that fundamentally we're, returning to the real biology of like how we operate as hunter-gatherers. And it's a much more exciting way to live because, that sort of, you learn one thing and only ever do one thing for your life and are stuck in a cubicle for the next 40, 50 years, that sucks. Yeah. Like, it's much more fun to be a hunter-gatherer, and like every day, like you're going out, you're evaluating the environment, and you're trying to have to figure out where the opportunities are. But then if you find something, if you, on one of those days, because that's the part of the point of hunter-gatherers is that, hunting is not a successful pastime. Most of the time you go out and you don't succeed. But then when you do succeed, you come back and you share your kill with the tribe. Because on the day when you don't make it, you're going to want somebody else to share their kill with you.
Yeah.
So these things this is actually, like our hardwired human biology. And so what Katherine is talking about here is not some radical leftist, collectivist new direction, but a return to where we came from.
Well said.
Hunter Watts can button a podcast like nobody's business, man. He buttons a podcast. Katherine, I'm sorry you got 3 words in, but the point is, we're men and you need to listen to it. All right?
I think you need to reread the book.
Yeah, I will. But I hope we did the book justice, at least in explaining what you can get out of it. And I will read it again because I need it.
And Katherine, I mean, I think that unconventional as this interview may have been, that it's maybe the best demonstration of the power and importance of this book and the challenges that we're all going to have as we all confront our different cultural biases one way or the other. And, we would love to have you back on. And, when we've all got our elephants a little bit more on control, and then we can, really sort of, just do a lot of slow thinking. And,
Katherine got us all riled up with your book. That's when you wrote a great book.
Yeah. Hey, yes, exactly. You had a reaction, and that's, that's half the battle.
Yeah, it's half the battle, or maybe the whole battle, because I didn't know I was going to be this uncomfortable when we started talking about it in a good way. And you were doing nothing but sort of listening, and then you'd say a couple things. I'd be like, hold on! Katherine!
Socialism!
Yeah. Anyway.
You're a saint, Katherine Ludwig. You're a saint.
It's been
else?
Fun.
Anything else, Katherine? Anything else? We can get the book. Let me say what the book is. Humility is the New Smart. And it's I'm trying to
by Katherine Ludwig and Ed Hess.
And Ed Hess. I was trying to find out Ed's name. Yes, but what is Ed Hess's background, Katherine?
So he is a professor at Darden, the business school at the University of Virginia. And I am an editor and a researcher there. So we've been working together for several years, doing a lot of research on the psychology of learning and human flourishing and all of that. So we're both at Darden.
Before I let you leave, how has this changed you in the way you think about things?
Oh, my goodness. It's greatly changed me. I'm a recovering perfectionist, type A type. And, I'm a recovering lawyer. It's definitely made me more humble, and I definitely try more on a moment-to-moment basis to be more mindful of my thoughts, emotions, behaviors, all of those things. And it's made me a much more nervous parent.
Wow. Yeah. How old are your children?
10 and 7.
So I have 6 and 9. So I'm right with you on that.
Yep.
Yeah. Trying to get them ready for the world. and that's great. Well,
yes.
Humility is the new smart, rethinking human excellence in the smart machine age. Edward Hess, Katherine, Ludwig. Read it or die. Read it or be a slave to your future. Too much? Too much, Katherine?
I loved it. I love it.
And a slave to your feelings. Because that's the thing, Brian, is that, you want to talk about real manliness?
Yeah.
Right now, you're a slave to your old culture.
Oh, no.
And
Katherine,
there, I heard a great quote the other day, which is that the best way to know if you still have a mind is to change it.
Katherine, help me! Somebody get me out of this responsibility. I want to go back to the 20th century.
You can avoid that responsibility by just insisting that your culture is actually the biology. Like, you can just keep doing that, Bri. That's an easy way to avoid it.
Man, I gotta go buy some hunting gear.
Yeah. Listen, and Bri, I just want to say, to your eternal credit, there is literally no other stand-up comedian on the planet that I could have done this podcast with. No one else would have had the tenacity to work through so many uncomfortable conversations for literally hundreds of episodes. So
I love it.
I salute you, Emperor Callan, for...
Catherine, you and your book and your ideas and your effort, I hope, I'll venture to say, have made me a better person today. So thank you so much. At least more aware.
And we'll relentlessly promote your book anywhere and everywhere we can. It's a great gospel, and I'm happy to be a zealot and a missionary for it.
Wonderful. Well, it's been a great conversation. And I appreciated all your interesting thoughts on it.
Thanks so much, Katherine.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.